Hello and welcome to this special launch of the 2021 Advance Survey of Global Australians. My name's Johanna Pitman, and I'm delighted to bring together this sneak peek of the results so that we can share what we've found out about overseas Australians with the community from which they come. Today we are joined by two experts to reflect on these survey findings, but also to share their insights about what is happening with the expat community overseas. We're joined by Peter O'Brien, Managing Director of Russell Reynolds Associates. We are so pleased. Advance conducts this survey each year, and we are so delighted that Russell Reynolds has partnered with us to deliver this survey this year. It's critical because the major thing that we hear from our members is questions about when you're overseas, how do you finding the right roles, but also when you come back to Australia, having that experience recognised, and to have an executive search and advisory firm like Russell Reynolds associated with this gives us that sort of expertise to be able to interpret the data that we'll see today. We're also delighted to be joined today by Elizabeth Ward, Australia's Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau. Elizabeth moved to Hong Kong about 1.5 years ago, but is very familiar with everything happening there with her previous roles associated with the free trade agreement. And I know there are a lot of burning questions about what's happening with the expat community in Hong Kong and Australians in Hong Kong more generally. And that's why we're delighted that she could join and share her perspective on that, as well as the entire question around how we leverage our Australian diaspora for the benefit of Australia. So I'm going to kick off with just a few key findings from the survey to ground that in the context. The survey was conducted over about a 3.5 month period, and it was distributed out through channels such as the Advance community, but also out to other channels through AusChams around the world. And we're very grateful to the AusChams that distributed the survey, because we know it's not just our community that we want to survey, we want to get it out to as many Australians overseas as possible. And we do this each year for a number of reasons. We want to uncover the characteristics, the demographics, the sentiment of Australians overseas and those who have recently returned. We want to be able to describe that experience of expats, and that's particularly a question that we wanted to raise this year. Was we wanted to dig into what the border measures have meant for expats overseas. And we also want to use the survey to understand the needs and ongoing connections of expats with Australia so we can improve advanced services. So we segment the audience into three main groups. That's those who have returned. We often refer to them as recently returned. Those who are living overseas but planning to return to Australia in the future, and those who have probably decided, and nothing's set in stone, but probably leaning towards living permanently overseas. And there are three main groups that are surveyed here. But we wanted to extend the survey this year to include two other very important groups that we know impact talent decisions, migration decisions of the community. And that's Australians planning to go overseas. And so we understand where that pipeline is coming from, as well as individuals connected to Australia through their work, their study, or relationships. And we call them Friends of Australia. We had 729 respondents. We always want more and more, and so we will come back out to the community next year, or later in this year, seeking those a large number of respondents from a overall community of an estimated 1 million Australians overseas. It's a representative sample, but you can draw your own conclusions as to how indicative it is in some cases, and we have noted that in the report where we think that we did not have a sufficient sample size of this particular group to draw conclusions, and therefore we have indicated that those are indicative only. But overall, we have a confidence level of 99%. And we know that the majority of people, when they return home, is to be with family and friends and lifestyle and quality of life. And we got some fantastic quotes around what it actually means to be back in Australia. We know that people are not generally returning for career, although that is mentioned by some, but it is particularly for those quality of life reasons. What's really interesting, and I've highlighted here the second point, the returnees' plans. I think this points to a really significant opportunity for employers, and that is that while of those who returned, 42% intend to stay permanently. But there's the rest of the respondents are either planning to go overseas at some point in the future or in the next year, or are undecided. And so that 58% of respondents who have returned, there's a massive opportunity for Australia and also a bit of a risk. If they don't find the right roles when they get back, they will look to go overseas again. And so we can either slow that or hasten it, depending on what sort of roles they secure in Australia. I won't go into all of these, but we know that those that do return, the majority have found roles. Only 3% indicated that they were still looking for a job, but it doesn't underestimate, that doesn't reduce the significance of how difficult finding a role can be. And Peter's certainly going to talk about his experience with seeing the experience and journey of many expats as they return, as well as when they're overseas. Obviously, the border restrictions was a big question in this, and no surprises that many had their plans cancelled or delayed. And I think it's also important to note that there was, even if that wasn't the main issue that affected them, it was also that personal hardship, anguish and frustration. And some really with a material impact on their career as well. Also very relevant is the connections people want to maintain when they're overseas. And what's really heartening across all the demographic groups that we surveyed, there's this real desire to stay connected while overseas or to assist others who want to go overseas. And so I think there is a real opportunity for us to make sure that those who are seeking help can find the people who want to provide that sort of mentoring networks or connections. There's an entire section for each demographic about what surprised you. What surprised you most when you came back to Australia? What do you expect? What surprised you most about the evolution of Australia while you've been overseas? And so depending on whether people have returned or if they're overseas, there are some different responses there. I think I'll leave that for you to see in the report, but certainly sort of pros and cons about the pandemic management in Australia, strict rules or good management. Also, obviously, the treatment of expats, it came up, as well as surprises around the cost of living. So a lot of, and that's really presented, that was asked as an open text question. And so then you've got quite a range of responses in there. All right, thank you, everyone. With that, I'd love to hand over to Peter O'Brien, Managing Director of Russell Reynolds Associates, to share his thoughts and reflections on what's happening at the moment.
Thank you, Johanna. And firstly, absolutely delighted to be here. It's a wonderful opportunity to obviously share certainly what our observations are, but also what we're finding in the market. But before I do so, I'd like to, on behalf of Russell Reynolds, actually express our great appreciation for the opportunity to partner with yourself, Johanna, and Advance for what has been an important survey. When you actually consider that Advance is the organisation that connects, supports, and celebrates the achievements of Australians living and working around the world, and Russell Reynolds' purpose is to provide leadership advice to organisations across the globe with the objective to improve the way the world is led, the reason to partner becomes quite obvious. That said, it's interesting when you look today, we have some of the world's most significant companies led by Australians. from industrial and resources companies, financial services and media, as well as technology and professional services. The view of Australians around the world is already well regarded. However, the question we are all grappling with is what will be the impact of this global pandemic on the global talent pool and what it specifically means for Australians. So to give context, there is no doubt that COVID has significantly upended the working world, and the virtual environment has since evolved. The question being asked is whether this shift will be advantageous to Australian leaders as they lead their companies into the future, whether based in Australia or abroad. However, before trying to address the question, it is actually important to appreciate that we have been living through a great deal more than a global pandemic these past couple of years. When you consider the many challenges across the globe, ranging from trade wars, civil unrest, geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, and extreme weathers, the list goes on. We have seen much of the world locked down with the inability to move across borders. And in Australia's case, that includes state borders as well. All these factors combined naturally have created a very different world for all of us over these past couple of years. Despite this, we are today living in one of the most intense environments where the demand for talent is so strong. We have seen a material shift across the globe, with Australia being no exception. So what does that mean for Australians residing both at home and abroad? Today is arguably one of the best times for Australians wishing to return home, given this demand for talent and the preparedness for companies to think more broadly. Keep in mind that there has been very limited appointments of foreigners to key roles these past couple of years in Australia. It is unique in terms of time. For those wishing to stay abroad, the same level of opportunity exists, given the unique demand for talent worldwide. Despite the significant challenges and frustrations faced, both personal and professional, it has created a different environment whereby leaders have had to learn to be more agile in how they operate and react to situations in the moment. Short and long-term planning has in some cases become absolutely obsolete. Leaders have had to become more vulnerable in how they interact with their people and accelerate their ability to listen and learn. There is no difference whether in Australia or offshore. This pivot to a virtual world has made the world smaller in many respects. No longer is it necessary to fly 24 hours on a plane to Australia to do business, but rather now it is very natural to interact regularly at the other end of the screen. This has created greater connectivity and allowed Australia to be, to some degree, on a more level playing field in many regards, with time zones often being the challenge. What we have seen change in Australia in recent times, and this is a very specific approach that we are taking in our work with clients, in actively looking for Australians offshore with the aim to attract them back to Australia for both executive and board roles. Our sense is that there has been a level of gravitation by Australians offshore to return home, either to be close to family or due to feeling a high degree of safety and seeking lifestyle. Interestingly, the surveys confirm that. Combine this with the growing war for talent, it creates real opportunity, which has not been there previously. In parallel to this, there has been a noticeable approach by boards in Australia to seek experience and capabilities of directors who intimately understand critical markets to their businesses, and at the same time, appreciate the cultural aspects of doing business in Australia. To actually illustrate the point, today, over 75% of Australian exports go to Asian countries. And the interconnectedness with Asia will only increase over time. Yet, of the ASX 100, less than 5% of the board directors have strong, relevant Asian experience. A further interesting observation over the past 2 years has been the number of Australians abroad who have relocated back to Australia, remaining employed in roles with foreign companies in North America and Europe, but working virtually from Australia and remaining effective. The question is whether this will be sustainable going forward when borders are fully open. Another interesting observation is when working with non-Australian leaders, one of the consistent factors recognised by them is that Australians have a respected attribute within their DNA, that is to pioneer new markets and new industries. They are prepared to take risks and step outside their comfort zone. This will remain a major opportunity to Australians as they travel and innovate. However, the single factor that has been a challenge through all these changes we have experienced living in this virtual world is the need for personal face-to-face connectivity. There remains a strong sense amongst business leaders that to be truly able to build and retain effective relationships, it can only be achieved through personal face-to-face connectivity. You cannot build trust and understanding through a Zoom meeting screen. So what we observe specific to Australians, we have seen an unusually large number of Australians seeking to return home over the past 2 years than previously, driven by being closer to family and seeking a safer and more predictable environment. However, it still is below what we expected, as in many cases, the appeal to larger markets remains high amongst expats. The difference in considering returning to Australia is, however, that it remains a trade-off between lifestyle and career. Different to the US, for example, where it is most often a return to headquarters to take on a larger role, the scale and opportunity is different, as Australia remains a strong domestically focused market. That said, we are in a unique point in time where there is much discussion and conviction that Australia today, more than ever, needs to better define its role on the global stage. What does it stand for, and how does it become more relevant globally? There continues to be debate on how it can become a more innovative and value-add player, playing to its strengths and competing effectively with other markets. Australia is a country that, early in its life, was known for what we grew up and managed on the land. Australia rode on the sheep's back. This was followed by what has been valued under the land, coal, iron ore, etc. The challenge for Australia today is actually determining what it is to be known for in the next phase of its life and how it leverages the talent pool available to it to achieve its goal. This is where this audience, the members of Advance, become extremely important. To have global-minded Australians help create the future role of Australia on a global stage for generations to come. Australia's opportunity is to be able to effectively pivot from traditionally being a predominantly conservative, domestic-focused mindset to one that wants to lead in certain areas on a global stage. Interestingly, we have that mindset in sport, yet yes, less so when it comes to the commercial arena. When you consider the success of Australians who today lead global organisations, whether sitting in North America or Europe, for example, there is no doubt about the competency and capability of them, as they have demonstrated a unique ability to adapt and pioneer. Australians are resilient, and this has been proven again through these past few years with all the challenges faced. All said and done, the challenge we recognise when Australians decide to return to Australia to live, having lived and worked abroad for many years, that is where the challenge arises. It is this factor of having worked in large-scale environments, often with responsibility for complex and often operations across multiple countries and cultures. What those aspiring returnees find is that upon looking to return to Australia, they see that the opportunities are most often for smaller roles with less complexity and scale. There does exist a trade-off. Yet my sense is that given today's demand for talent in Australia, combined with Australia's need to reposition itself on a global stage, there will be more opportunities to create roles that fit more closely with the skills and experience of those seeking to return. It is so important that those looking to return do their due diligence well in advance of returning, and also ensure they remain connected with Australia and its business community. The beauty about Australia is that we will always have those who wish to be expats and one day want to return, and we'll have those that move abroad and will never actually return to live. Both parties are so important to the future of Australia as a country and its repositioning on the world stage. So just in final, I was asked to make comments regarding what are the major competencies required today in leaders, given the complexity of the world we're living in. And we could talk about this through the Q&A if felt of interest. The lens upon which we advise our clients today, and whether it's actually they're appointing an external leader or whether it's developing their own internal leaders, it's typically through the lens looking at 5 key aspects. First and foremost is having a learning mindset, being prepared to understand new things and new ways of operating. Secondly, being vulnerable, open to criticism and acknowledging mistakes. Thirdly, being empathetic, able to connect with people, particularly at the front line. We've lived in a challenging world where mental health continues to be a major factor. This is an issue that leaders need to work through and be empathetic about. Agility, being able to pivot and adapt when necessary. And finally, being able to listen and create fellowship. So in final closing, we are dealing with a more complex, uncertain and changing world. Leaders need to adapt and do so quickly. And to do this, it is critical that they surround themselves with those who they can learn from. Again, thank you, Johanna, in advance for the opportunity to partner with you. I look forward to the Q&A session, but we'll pass back to yourself, Johanna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And what an amazing call to action there to really look at what Australia is to be known for going forward in the next phase of our development and how we move from that conservative domestic focus to competing globally and really specialising in what we're good at and leveraging our strengths. So I'm sure lots of questions. In fact, we've got a couple coming through already. So we'll move to, we'll come back, obviously, Q&A, lots of questions there. I'd like now to ask the Consul General of Hong Kong and Macau, Elizabeth Ward, for your comments and your perspective on what you're seeing with the expats overseas.
Thanks, Johanna, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be watching this session from. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to join you here today. Of course, I'm a global nomad. For the last 30 years, for my professional, for my profession, I've been moving around the globe, in and out of Australia. I've lived in the Middle East, in the US, in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, in India, and now, of course, in Hong Kong. And I guess until I got to Hong Kong, my understanding of and knowledge of the expat community was limited actually to what it appeared that everyone else in the world was doing. I feel like in my first posting in Cairo in 1990, there were probably a sum total of 0 Australian expats. And of course, I over-egg it. There, of course, have been expats over the course of my career. But Hong Kong has been an eye-opener. And, you know, for me, not just about the size of the community, it's this is our second largest expat community globally, second only to the United Kingdom. We have 100,000 Australians in Hong Kong, according to our passport issuance. I think we would probably say that 80% of those passport holders are dual nationals, just for background. So people who are ethnically Chinese who've moved out of Hong Kong during various waves of migration and then have moved back to Hong Kong. So we'd say about 20,000 probably fall into that expat category here. So, you know, the thing that's so striking for me here is that not just that there is this group of people who've taken this moment to live and work overseas, benefiting from location, from history, from a fascinating culture, a recognisable economic infrastructure and a shared legal system to really make their life and their career. But actually what Australia has been able to contribute to Hong Kong and some of the facets of Hong Kong which are have undeniably an Aussie flavour to them. It's always apparently marvellously organic the way these things happen. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people who've said, oh, I thought I'd come here for a year and see how it was. And 20 years later, 30 years later, here I still am. I've made my life. I've had a family. My kids are now here forging their careers. But it is that kind of the flip side of the equation, the investment in Hong Kong by Australians to help shape their social and cultural environs. And it's had a huge impact, of course. It's not by mistake that Australia is a hugely popular destination for education. It's not by mistake that it's an attractive holiday destination. I mean, it is actually quite a long way from Hong Kong to Australia. You know, you could just as easily hop on a plane and go to Europe, but people absolutely love coming to Australia. There are so many family ties, and I think all of that is a direct result of the sort of investment that Australians have made over generations in this place. So, you know, the community is here a crown jewel for Australia and a substantial reason why we have a significant consular presence here in Hong Kong. We, of course, provide services, but I see my role not only to be a service provider to this community, but also to work out how do we leverage the value that this community provides to Hong Kong to really ensure that we can grow our relationship with Hong Kong. How do we use it to build our educational prowess? How do we use it to deepen research and cultural links? And all the things that Peter was saying, I found it very interesting to hear his comments about the sorts of skill sets on offer and which we perhaps take for granted a little bit are so important in demonstrating to, certainly I see it here in Hong Kong all the time, demonstrating the value that Australia has. You know, we churn out innovators, outcomes oriented, people who are practical, can do fixes, low key, not kind of terribly self-important, maybe a few, but, people like to have us round because we provide a range of skills and options that is not a common one. And I think we don't see that necessarily. So it really never ceases to amaze me, the sort of capacity and quality that we have on offer around this city in Hong Kong, the cultural leaders in the community here, the world-renowned academics we have here, the quality of the professionals, and all of the networks that they have created here. These are all hugely important, not just for the community, but actually as a statement of what Australia can deliver to the world. And of course, there's all this untapped potential. It never ceases to amaze me when I ask people in the community who perhaps haven't had that much to do, they're not kind of in the Australia infrastructure in Hong Kong, would you like to do some stuff with us to promote Australia? Everyone's so supportive and enthusiastic. And it's just been absolutely delightful to discover this part of my, it's been an important part of the Hong Kong experience for me. But of course, having said all that, the last 3 years has been pretty tough in Hong Kong. Predating the coronavirus, Hong Kong was in a world of hurt. Those protests that were all over the television in 2019 rolled into a whole world of changes and reforms in Hong Kong, the promulgation of a national security law, the suppression of freedoms, civil society really being clamped down upon. It's changed the tone and the feel of the place a lot. I've seen it even in the 18 months that I've been here. And of course, we track this pretty closely. And I've got to say, even though the International Financial Centre is hale and hearty up until perhaps a couple of weeks ago, and I'll come to that in a minute, there has been a change to, the feel of the place. And I think that does matter, and it's something that's in people's, something that people that think about when they're considering whether they want to stay somewhere long term. When I say up until a couple of weeks ago, Hong Kong up until a couple of weeks ago had done a marvellous job in controlling the pandemic. There was a very strong sense that they learned from their 2003 SARS pandemic moment, and they just did not want the coronavirus to get out of control in a place that is very, very densely packed and where many people live in very difficult living circumstances. And so Hong Kong put in place a very, very tough COVID policy, which has meant that movement in and out of the city has become quite challenging. They've transitioned or maintained, perhaps is a better way of putting it, online learning for schools, which had sort of started during that protest period. So that's sort of been a rolling feature for expat families here. And now with a wave of the Omicron variant of European proportions, can I say, in this city with a relatively unvaccinated group of elderly citizens, it's sort of laying waste as we speak. And that has been very difficult. There's been great anxiety. The government, as I said, has had in place pretty tough coronavirus policies, but this has only become tougher as this variant has taken hold in the city. So there are, rumours abound of Chinese-style lockdowns. There are some, awful stories of kids being separated from parents in hospitals, all the sorts of things that have people really now, if they hadn't already been thinking about, do I want to be away from my family? How do I handle this situation? Now this uncertainty and fear is actually driving people to really consider whether they want to be in here, and people are leaving. We're seeing we're seeing our consulate lines of people lining up for emergency travel documents so that they can get out. And while Hong Kong is largely closed, so last week I was reading in the paper, on one day there were only 300 people came into Hong Kong, compared with tens of thousands that would daily come in through that busy international airport. I saw the EU citing that 10% of their citizens have left in the last year, but now those numbers are accelerating. The net outflow last week was 70,000 people, so 230 coming in a day, but 70,000 was the net outflow. So huge kind of numbers leaving. Now, a lot of those people will be leaving temporarily, and of course, I'm not just talking about expats. I'm talking about the whole of the community, or anyone with the capacity to leave and the financial ability to leave. So it is a moment for sure, and a moment that's been compounded by all of these events. The political changes, the uncertainty of the coronavirus, and now actually having this very uncertain time with this wave upon us. But living abroad, let me just turn and quickly summarise. Living abroad among a group of expats and watching this exodus has given me real pause for thought about how to assess this prevailing trend, and an equation now inverted. So instead of me asking what value are we providing, what can we do to leverage this terrific community overseas, it's now what opportunities does this movement, this repatriation, mean for Australia, and what opportunities does it present? So I've read a summary of the results of advance.org, and I think it's fantastic that we're having this conversation, Johanna. So thank you so much for initiating this and for driving this through. For me, the changing dynamic brings with it some unprecedented benefits for Australia, if only we can really tap it and channel it and drive it. So for me, at the most fundamental level, this is about, and I'm just talking on behalf of Hong Kong right now, a group of highly educated, capable Australians who spent their lives living, working, and understanding how to do business, who are China literate and who are now ready and willing to enter the Australian economy. So it's about an opportunity to change a narrative on the way Australia changes with Asia. It's about expanding a vision of what we believe we can do from our place in Australia, in a place that shares the same business hours as Asia. And it's about really channeling that no fuss, can do kind of attitude that appears to be the hallmark of the community in Hong Kong, and which has made Australia so successful in Hong Kong. And using those ingredients, which can so easily be deployed back home, and just having that vision to get moving, to do this, and to work out how we can really benefit from this opportunity. So thanks for this, allowing me to speak to you, and look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And what a roller coaster it's been in Hong Kong. And thank you for underpinning it with the real positive attributes of that expat community that has been built over many years, and then sharing with us how it has changed over the last 3 or so years, and particularly in the last few weeks. So it's I'm sure it's still evolving, and we'll see what happens. But one of the things that you mentioned at the very beginning was that Hong Kong has the second biggest expat community. And this is always a challenge, second biggest community of Australians living overseas. And this is always a big challenge for us, because we quote that 1 million Australian diaspora. And yet within the diaspora, there are dual citizens who may have migrated to Australia and now have gone back to their country of origin, but remain connected to, they've still got their Australian connections. And then you've got those that we call expats that are living overseas and grew up in Australia, and therefore maybe intended to be temporarily overseas, and then maybe, like you say, it goes on for a couple of decades before they realise, wow, where'd the time go? So this has actually caused quite, when at the beginning talking about the methodology of the survey and talking about the statistical significance of being able to survey people, I think we clearly are reaching many more of the expat community than those dual citizens. If we were reaching those dual citizens and those individuals, and we've got a question through on the chat around, would we think about widening the definition of the Australian diaspora to include migrants who have left Australia? And is there value to connect with this group of migrants? Absolutely. The dual citizens are incredibly valuable, but it does cause some problems when you're trying to get representative sentiment from these different groups of people, because they've got very different experience. So that's, I think it's important context, because the survey obviously has some pinpoints the US as being the main location for expats. And I think that's because they're much more, that's where a lot of people go to extend their career professionally, as well as, and it shows the other countries as well. So with that, I would love to go back to some of the questions raised earlier. And thank you, Peter, for talking about the how Australians can returning Australians can leverage their global skills. How do you think, how do they apply that to assist Australia to make this transition? As one individual, you're focused on getting the right job for yourself, but collectively, how is this going to assist Australia to do that pivot, to have that more global outlook and global perspective that you talked about as the vision for the future?
Thanks, Johanna. I mean, a couple of things, at least for thought. I think given the environment that we've just experienced in the last couple of years around trade, let me call them trade wars that have evolved, not just with Australia, with other countries. What's become much more clear in the discussions I've had with boards and CEOs of Australian companies is they've recognised they've put their eggs in one basket traditionally in how they actually trade, and recognise they now need to look at things quite differently. And so there is a growing appetite to learn from those in other markets that they don't know about, and they need to work out a strategy around. And so somehow we need to get the connection of those Australians who are in these roles, who have the insight, the richness of intelligence, of markets, risk, so on and so forth, that can start to engage with Australian organisations. I mean, this is the point partly made earlier about those offshore, even though they may not be considering returning to Australia for some time, remaining connected, because the ability to provide insight and intelligence around how best to either interact in different markets or deal with certain products or deal in certain industry sectors becomes quite unique. And that is where connectivity often starts, at just that connection between current leaders in Australia and those abroad. And there is, as I said, there is a growing appetite. We see that. And one of the roles that, may be surprising for those who are in this session, one of the roles that we find our role has evolved into is connecting. We have operations around the world, but the necessity and the requests that we have from clients to help us connect us to people, whether it be in South America or other parts of the world, is growing. And that's where that connectivity with individuals that we're talking with here become more important.
Peter, you also touched on, though, that the boards are open and looking for that international expertise. From the individual's perspective, how do they identify the ones that are open to that? Because from the outside looking in, and particularly when you're going for these roles, it can look like there's not an openness to it. How do you pick the ones that are open to that international experience?
So I think this comes down to the due diligence point. It's very important to ensure you're actively understanding the Australian market, even you might be on the other side of the world, and building relationships and finding, for example, the opportunity when you may visit Australia to see family, to use it as a chance to reconnect with the business community. It's becoming known. That's really important. But I think the one thing I would stress here, Johanna, is it's a long-term game. It's getting known, investing the time both ways. And those opportunities are rising. I mean, we're finding now, as we start to map out and identify Australians around the world who could potentially be on the radar, one, it's important to be known by the firms who are doing that ourselves, but I can't take away the importance of getting to know the directors directly yourself as you evolve and build relationships.
That's fantastic advice, and certainly something we'll be noting in our material for people who are returning and really trying to be proactive about being known. You mentioned, Elizabeth, about the opportunities this repatriation of so many people has for Australia, that opportunity there and how we're going to tap it. And I guess if I can sort of link those conversations and turn that to you, Peter, any thoughts on what Australia should do to tap into that repatriation of those individuals that are returning, and particularly with that China expertise? What advice, having heard Elizabeth's remarks, you might be giving to your clients about what they should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's in this world we live in, the visibility of what people are doing and their plans and activities. And we live in a world now where communication is so much more free-flowing than it was even 5 years ago. It is being proactive. It's reaching out and finding who are the right organisations to be connected with. I certainly am finding with a number of the organisations that I work with, even the necessity for them to travel. Boards pre-COVID were becoming more regularly held outside Australia. They were actually pulling boards together once or twice. That's been obviously halted through this virtual world. But as we are starting to come out again, there are boards across most sectors who are wanting to spend time in Asia, in North America, in Europe, and they will start over the second half of this year making that happen. It's connecting when they visit these parts of the world, an Australian community that can help them get insights, but again, build relationships. A lot of this is quite pragmatic, but it is also just about being conscious of investing time up front to build the relationships.
Elizabeth, from your perspective, if you had those sort of visits from different boards, how would you see, how would you sort of, and obviously as one overseas post, but how would that happen, and how would you make that happen to enable people to really understand what those needs are from the Australian side, but also to enable Australians to learn firsthand from those on the ground?
It's a sort of a theoretical question for me at this point, Johanna. Unfortunately, actually, ever since I've been here in a COVID setting, so it really hasn't been a BAU environment in the way that Hong Kong has run in the past. However, I do know from a lot of my colleagues that they have been engaged closely with boards. And in fact, some of them have really taken the initiative to write to boards and say, why don't you come, to Singapore? Why don't you come to Bangkok? Why don't you come to Hong Kong and host and have, one of your meetings here, and we'll set up a program for you and we'll help you. And so I think the government can play a role for anyone who's listening in who may be interested in this sort of thing as the world comes to rights and people feel like they want to chance their arm and hop on a plane again. I think this is exactly the sort of thing that embassies around the world can be doing to help we are in a space where in Australia we're looking at how do we get the economy kind of ramped up again after a couple of years of being very, very quiet on a number of fronts. And here's a great way that we can really start to engage.
So true. And I know on the webinar today, we have a number of people joining from AusChams around the world. And obviously the AusChams do an incredible job of connecting those Australian businesses with local businesses with Australia. And but it sounds like Peter's articulated a real opportunity here to connect those activities with the broader national goal of making our economy more competitive and more globally focused. I just wanted to drill down a little bit, Elizabeth, on the exit rates for Hong Kong expats. And you mentioned the number of passport applications, so you're seeing a lot of those dual citizens moving to Australia. So are you seeing that the exit rates for expats are outpacing the number of foreigners moving in? And what effect has this had on Australia and Hong Kong, and sort of what opportunities does this create? And so this is one of the questions from the Q&A. Thank you.
Oh, it's actually one of those $10 million questions, and I guess one of the tasks that we have in the consulate is to try and monitor exactly what's going on, and it's very difficult because there's no specific database. There's no way that we, apart from issuing passports, we don't know whether people are choosing then immediately to leave or they've just got those, so that they're ready to go. We don't collect the data at the border coming in or collate it in the way that would give us a very clear sense of what's going on in terms of assessing the relativities of expat movement versus, the whole of the Australian group of citizens in Hong Kong. However, I guess I can tell you a few things about what's going on. We have perceived that earlier, the movements last year that we were looking at. I mean, Australia's border was pretty much closed last year, so we could see that a lot of Hong Kongers were moving out. We knew that a lot of people were waiting to get back into Australia, and our presumption is there have been a lot of people now moving now that the border has reopened. The expat community has been less impacted by the political changes and the rolling kind of reforms and all the stresses that the local community have been under. Has been less of a factor for the expat community, I would say. But the online learning issues and now this fear and uncertainty about what's coming with this current wave of the epidemic, that's actually tipped a lot of people. And so I think probably for the last 2 months, but in particular in the last 2 weeks, we have just been bombarded with people wanting to get emergency travel documentation, not a standard validity passport, but a emergency so that they can move. And we are seeing that, and we can only anticipate that, we keep in touch with the airlines. We know that the flights for the next month are full. There aren't many of them because flights in the other direction from Australia to Hong Kong have been banned. So it's hard for the airlines to find a commercially viable kind of mechanism to put on lots of flights, but the flights that are available are full. And so people are flying through Singapore. There are options available, but the airlines are monitoring this very closely.
Wow, and it certainly is something for those individuals to navigate. If I can give a shout out to the Facebook group, Aussie Expats Coming Home, incredible sharing of kind of tips and tricks around the different logistical challenges of getting home, and a lot of support for individuals and each other as they go through that. And I think, with these, it's been unprecedented for 2 years now, but if it's the different nature of the challenge each time and as it evolves, and so really important to sort of leverage whatever information people can find and what communities can provide that support.
Can I just add, Joanna, I'm sorry, and I should have said this, I'm talking about a moment in time. And of course, that's kind of looming large for me, which is why I'm talking about it. And it looms large for everyone who's in Hong Kong. But, this is a city which historically has had waves of migration. And people, for almost every decade since the Second World War, there have been waves of people leaving for one reason or another. And then, waves of people moving back in. And so we shouldn't assume, and I just want to make this point, that this is the end of Hong Kong. It's neither the end of Hong Kong, nor is it the end of expatriates or Australians being in Hong Kong. This is a moment in time. And of course, as the world comes to rights, people will move back to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong will continue just fine.
So true, and it's something that keeps evolving. I've got a couple of questions here for Peter, so maybe you might. They're all related to the same question, same sort of topic, but it's around if you can just sort of focus or share some tips for newly arrived returning Australians to find meaningful work. And Lisa asks about noting that the Australian market in certain circles, as we've talked about, doesn't recognise that international experience. Might be changing now, but how do you position yourself to find meaningful work? And Rivka, leading on from this, what about for senior leaders with global experience? Tips to help them find a local role? And if we go one more down a specific sector, just comment if you're able to comment on the state of natural resources and ESG executive talent needs in Australia at the moment.
Okay, well, let me try and pick those off, and you might have to remind me, Joanna, if I've missed. I mean, there is no doubt it is a challenge once you've arrived. I look at the first question and you're looking to engage. And given the circumstance of already being now back in Australia, it is really important how you go about it. And what I mean by that is where you invest your time, where you don't. So again, to be fairly direct on it, I'm a big believer that you should invest 80+% of your time endeavoring to talk directly with people in industry. That I think is really important. I think what often happens is individuals waste a lot of time talking to recruitment and search firms. And that may sound very strange coming from me, but I actually think it is really important to get the balance right. And when you start to engage with the market, it's important to leverage the relationships you have. It might be family, it might be friends, who can allow you to engage with people who are in different sectors and industries to get advice, and start to, and we all know, we touched on it before, the Australian market, one of the things that is very unique, and I'm sure those who've returned have seen this, there is an element of humility in Australia that is part of the way that people will engage. And what I mean by that is your ability to engage and create the pull, not the push. And so being able to articulate what you've been doing and how that might be relevant. But the reality is it's going to be kissing a lot of frogs. And that's just part of the exercise of trying to do your due diligence in starting to work out who the individuals are worthwhile investing your time engaging with, and try not to waste too much time talking to those who frankly are not going to add a huge amount of value. And that sounds very hypothetical, but it's really important, because I think one of the things that I've found over time, and I myself lived many years abroad in Asia and prior to that in Europe, and I was quite surprised when I first returned to Australia how difficult it was just to engage with people, even people from a similar industry I'd come from. So I think everyone faces that. It's being clever to leverage the relationships you've got and not waste time would be my initial bit of advice. On the second question, dealing with executives and senior roles, it's probably not too different. The one thing that is important is leveraging the relationships you have with directors and the director world. That is critical, because boards today in Australia, one, are more accountable than they've ever been for the culture of an organisation, as well as the development and the creation of talent within an organisation. So they today have a vested interest in knowing who actually is coming into the market. So that would be a very strong tip, is to leverage relationships you have with those who sit on boards. And by the way, they don't necessarily just need to be on boards of big listed companies. They could be not-for-profits, government boards, private companies, private equity. It's getting into that flow. On the third question regarding industrial and ESG, I mean, what's been fascinating, we've been working the last 4 or 5 years partnering with the UN Global Compact, specifically focused on sustainability. And the interesting little bit of a statistic for you is part of the research we did. In 2015, we looked at 4,000 job descriptions of senior people around the world, all sectors, not just industrial. 4% of those position specification had any mention of anything to do with ESG, even though those organisations were claiming they were focusing on ESG. In 2019, that number had moved to 15%, but the move is far too slow. And I think, as we've seen over the past year or two, a lot of the noise has been raised of a lot of talk, but little action. And I feel that there is now more pressure than there has been previously on boards and CEOs to really step up and act on these activities of focusing on ESG. Now, in terms of the industrial and the natural resources sector, you know, without pulling them out, we're aware of a number of serious events that have happened in some organisations, whether it be socially related or climate change related. So proxy investors and investors at large are now putting more pressure on the ESG factor than they've ever done before. So it is a major pressure. I think in terms of industrial, it's only going to become more important. I think the part that probably is falling behind is the G, where the E&S probably been getting greater priority. I think boards now are facing more accountability, and therefore governance is starting to step up. I'm not sure if I've fully answered the questions, Johanna, but I've tried to have a shot at all three.
No, that was perfect. And thank you to Kay Mims and Benjamin Wong all asking questions around this point. You mentioned there that 80% of your time on those conversations and those relationships in industry versus with recruiting firms, and that is, so timely advice, because one of the things that I think is most soul destroying for returning Australians is having a lot of conversations with recruiting firms, hearing getting negative feedback, and really thinking, well, why'd I come home at all? And so it's developed this negative reputation. How do we convince, and this is more for Advance's benefit, but also for those who know people who are returning home, how do we convince them to go with your network first? How do we change this sort of approach when you come home, instead of going straight to Seek or, Indeed, or for the senior roles, going to those sites and looking at jobs, but really to build your network first? It almost feels like that's a very hard suggestion to get people to take on board. And I think, I'd be interested in knowing kind of why that is, and why we have this default to sort of contacting recruiting firms, which we're sort of seeing is not yielding the right results.
I mean, my sense is, Johanna, is that people are reluctant when they return to engage with people who they feel might be senior, busy, and certainly distracting their time. My advice is quite the opposite. I've been quite impressed in Australia how often senior people on board, CEOs, CFOs, do make themselves available to help. I mean, I think it's a very general sweeping point I'm making, but by and large, people generally try and help. And I think the ability to reach out and ask advice is a compliment, and most will see it as that. So I would encourage people to have the confidence to be proactive and reach out and try and have that opportunity to have a coffee. And it can sound intimidating on occasions, but it is quite important in building the relationships. The way I would best define it is, when you're looking to return or you have returned, you are needing to do a due diligence, because the decision you make about the organisation you join, the culture, etc., is really important. So it makes sense to do your due diligence, and that is tapping into your network of people to get advice and insight into.
Thank you. And it echoes something in one of our Next Gen program sessions. We've had a couple of our award winners have come back and given their advice to some of the individuals who are looking to go overseas or early in their career. And that concept of kissing a lot of frogs, that's come up for sure. And not being afraid to reach out to people on LinkedIn or within your network, and know that, if you put 5 requests out there, you might get 3 responses, and that's much better than no requests out there and no responses. I think the other really good advice was around to not push too hard, don't be too much too soon. And certainly one of the phrases that was provided was, or one of the sort of lines in your thing was, do you have 15 minutes? Can I have 15 minutes of your time? I've just got 1 or 2 things I'd love to ask of you, or ask about. I'd love to ask about 1 or 2 things. So you really sort of make it a short discussion, and invariably it will end up being much more open and much more than that, but it gives you that in. So really, thank you for sharing those tips, very timely. I wanted to understand one more question, Peter, for you around the trade-offs. That was a really important part about the trade-offs for expats for lifestyle versus career, or the sort of the scope of the role that they might be coming back for. When you're advising your clients, how do you advise them to make jobs in Australia more attractive to returning Australians? And is it just about the salary?
Yeah, I mean, there's more. It's more than, interestingly enough, and maybe not surprisingly enough, it's more than the salary. It's so much about the role being something that is going to enthuse and push and stretch individuals. And it really comes down to the organisation. Are they an organisation? I'll use a very generic example. Are they an organisation that is looking to expand? Are they strategically looking to move into other markets? And therefore, the opportunity to have someone who's returning to Australia who has experience in those markets is unique. And it's a lot of it sounds like being at the right place at the right time. And in many cases it is, which to me is having the discussions with board directors, whether it's when they visit other markets or in your own individual visits back to Australia, to understand what organisations are doing. You know, if you look at, for example, you know, there are organisations in the industrial space like Amcor or Brambles that have effectively moved their headquarters offshore, but they are still listed publicly in Australia. So there are things that are happening in corporate Australia that may not be obvious on the surface, which comes back to this point of being inquisitive and dig in and understand what is happening in the market. The other area that is remarkably important to the future of this country is technology and innovation. And so the days of everyone running to Silicon Valley to learn about the future is now starting to be questioned, because we know what's going on in southern parts of China in technology are as creative and innovative as other parts of the world. And so individuals who can bring different experiences around core areas, data analytics, technology and other areas, are going to be hugely valuable to organisations. And so it's how they get that entry point. And again, coming back to how do they build relationships that they become relevant and frankly known.
Thanks, Peter. And leads really well into the next question about looking at those possibilities and collaboration opportunities between Australia and places like Hong Kong. Elizabeth and Peter, if you could comment on this one, and particularly with your experience, Elizabeth, on the free trade agreement, what sort of opportunities exist for collaboration between organisations in Hong Kong and Australia? Are there structures in place to allow for this?
Well, it's a sort of a broad question, obviously, and it depends on what exactly we're talking about. I would say that for SMEs in Australia who are looking to collaborate with Hong Kong, I mean, I think there's plenty of opportunities, and I think Hong Kong is also pitching itself into the future and is thinking about how to position itself in a slightly new environment, and it's really thinking about what is Hong Kong's value add in the China context, and in particular, they are looking at this area called the Greater Bay Area. So they're really trying to work out, in Hong Kong, how to do this. Now, Hong Kong is a great place to start off your engagement in China and in Asia, because it's easy and recognisable. Its structures and its laws are, easy to manage. So the question then is, how do you get in? Of course, the Australian Trade Commission has a very dynamic office here in Hong Kong. You mentioned AusCham previously. They are also a great channel for anyone that's sort of interested but not quite sure how to get started in Hong Kong. I think, engaging with those two sources as a point of entry is probably one of the best ways that you can get yourself organised.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Anything from you, Peter, on that question?
I mean, the only point I would make is and Elizabeth touched on the Greater Bay Area, which is focusing on becoming the tech hub of the world. It's organisations that find places that have relevancy, they can learn from, they can create value, and which comes back down to the people issues, having individuals who can gravitate across those different markets. which again is why people who've spent time offshore in different markets typically has an advantage over someone who hasn't. So, you know, these things do come together, but it's working out which are the markets that are relevant to the sector or the industry or the company that you're working with. But the government, the opportunity through some of these government organisations is exceptional. And I don't think Australia today is taking as much advantage corporate-wise as it should.
Great, and a great call to action there for those that are looking to expand and to do have those kind of international relations. I'm aware of time, but I did want to make sure we made time for this really important question around, and both of you touched on the state of mental health due to the pandemic, and thinking about and how that impacts individuals, but also what businesses are doing to support their employees through it. One of the things that we touch on in the survey is we note the resilience and what overseas Australians have endured through the pandemic, because on top of everything else they're experiencing locally, that yearning to be back is really significant. So it's a resilient crowd that we're talking to, and yet been through so much. So this is really, I think, a timely thing to finish on today. From both of your global perspectives, have you seen businesses more open to the idea of prioritising mental health, and organisations more open to the idea of prioritising mental health, such as time with family, parental leave, working from home, flexible working hours? Or is the global skill shortages creating more pressure for employees and employers?
It's a really, really good question. And there's no silver bullet on this one, I'll say, at least in my mind. There are organisations, I have to say, in Australia who are very mindful of their obligations and their responsibilities in terms of mental health. At the same time, many of these organisations are in industries that are busier and have more opportunity than they've ever had. And it's how do you get the balance right with your people to make sure they don't feel the pressure that is actually creating suffering in terms of mental health. The other area that I think is becoming a factor that has not been spoken about is, even at the most higher levels in organisations, it's hard to sometimes identify mental health. And often very senior leaders will know they're suffering, but feel they cannot actually acknowledge that suffering. So it's a very complex issue. I think that there's a lot of work being done across most organisations that I see of trying to navigate it carefully. But there are lots of issues being addressed, whether it be many of them you've just touched on, whether it be parental leave, leave without pay, or whatever it may be, or having people taking sabbaticals, seeing a lot of that. And I think we will see a lot of that. We talk about the Great Resignation and people, and we're seeing elements of that play out as well. So it is a really concerning issue. And I think boards themselves are now, I'm seeing in Australia to be specific, and now starting to talk about mental health as an item on the agenda. And are they seeing the signs? What if they're not seeing the signs? Because that is a concern.
There's not a lot that I can add to what Peter's had to say. I mean, obviously, there's been a seismic change in the way that mental health is considered as a result of what's happened globally in the last 2 years. So all of a sudden, to the extent that this wasn't on the agenda previously, it's now absolutely on the agenda of every company, every government around the world. The extent to which that is a profound and lasting agenda, I guess, is the question, and the extent to which that really does force changes in the culture of companies and governments, in the way that workforces are dealt with and treated. This is all, still a question that we'll see the answer to that over the years. However, I've got to say, I've had so many conversations over the last couple of years, just as we all have, about with our friends, our colleagues and people, that we're meeting, in my case, for the first time, talking about, what are the issues confronting your business, and how are you dealing with that? And I've got to say that where in the past mental health was not in the top 10, it's now in the top 3. Yep. And it's something that people are talking about openly and considering how best to manage. So I feel like that is an important change and something that we need to encourage.
Really, really timely. And I guess I in light of that question, and I volunteer outside of this role as a Lifeline crisis counsellor, and it's really interesting that one of the services that we're trained in is the fact that we may receive calls from overseas, and usually that is when someone is at a very low state and suicidal, or really going through a lot of mental health issues overseas. They contact Lifeline and they get put through to the Australian call centre, even though they're overseas, through the consular services overseas, which is an incredible service. But it also reminds, or I feel like it's important to note that it doesn't have to reach that point to call and take advantage of that service. It is a crisis service. It's not a suicide line. It is crisis, and everyone's crisis is different. So certainly a really good question. I'm not sure who posted that, but thank you very much for providing that. I have one more question here for Peter, but I am going to send it to you and ask for maybe if you can email, or we'll get it afterwards, because I really do want to make sure we finish on time. I've in the chat, well, thank you for your comments. There are lots of comments coming through to thank Elizabeth and Peter for their insight, sharing their time and their knowledge of what's going on so openly, and really appreciate that you were able to reflect on some of these findings, but also on your experience at the moment. With that, thank you both. And to all of those watching, thank you very much for joining today.